It's amazing how just one verse, a handful of words in the Quran, have been used for centuries to justify domestic violence. But what if the translation we've all been reading is just plain wrong? Today, we're diving into a really compelling argument from author J.R. Ahmed that challenges, well, pretty much everything we thought we knew about this incredibly controversial text. So here it is. This is the translation of Quran 434 that's at the very heart of this whole debate. It's a single verse that has caused so much pain and controversy. But the author we're looking at today argues that this entire understanding is built on just a few critical mistranslations. Okay, to really get what this alternative view is saying, we need to break the verse down into three key ideas. First, this concept of male superiority. Second, the demand for female obedience. And third, that final, deeply troubling command to beat them. Let's tackle them one by one. So you see how this single verse creates this whole power structure, right? Men are the managers, women have to be obedient, and if they're not, physical discipline is on the table. But the author's whole point is that if we actually go back to the original Arabic, this entire structure just falls apart. All right, let's start right at the beginning of the verse, with the word used to describe what men's role is, Qawwamoona. Now, most translations render this as managers or in charge of, which, immediately sets up a power imbalance from the get-go. And this is where we really get into the linguistic details. The author argues that the root word here, QWM, is all about providing, about maintaining. It's not a claim of authority at all, but a statement of financial responsibility. This one change completely flips the meaning, from power over women to a duty of care for them. That's a huge shift.
Okay, but what about other verses? A common counterargument you'll hear comes from Quran 2:22-8. Which is often wheeled out to prove men have some kind of built-in advantage. The author says this is just a classic case of taking a phrase completely out of its context.
But look what happens when you actually read the whole verse. The meaning changes dramatically. It's so clearly talking about divorce proceedings. The advantage isn't some general statement about men being better. It's a specific, practical difference related to biology and when you can remarry. It's about logistics, not status.
All right, next up is the second big word, tatun. This one is almost always translated to mean that righteous women are obedient to their husbands, and it's really the foundation for demanding a wife's submission. And here's the author's key linguistic point, and it's a powerful one. Everywhere else this word appears in the Qur'an, it describes devotion and submission to God and only to God. It is never, ever used to describe one person's obedience to another. Just look at these examples from all over the Qur'an, whether it's the entire universe, believers at prayer, Mary, or righteous men and women. The one they are devoted to is always God. So the author asks a pretty simple question. If this word means obedient to God every single other time, why on earth would it suddenly mean obedient to husbands in this one verse? And it gets even more specific. The author points out that many translators actually add the words return to before obedience. It's a subtle change, but it implies that obedience to a husband is the default state. The author argues the original text is just about a wife yielding to her husband's attempts to reconcile, not submitting to his authority.
And now we come to the most loaded word in the entire verse, wadribuhunna, which, as we've said, is almost always translated as beat them.
You can just feel how uncomfortable people are with this command. Even traditional scholars who accept the translation try to soften it, adding words like lightly, or, in this pretty unforgettable example, with a toothbrush. That alone tells you how jarring this command is within a faith that constantly preaches mercy. So let's look at the actual root word here, dharb. According to the author, this word is incredibly versatile in Arabic. The problem is, translators have latched onto just one of its many meanings, to strike, and pretty much ignored the dozens of others.
Just look at this range. The same root can mean to strike, sure, but it can also mean to separate, to withdraw, to give examples, or to stop something. The author argues that in the context of a marriage dispute, a nonviolent meaning like separate from them or give them examples just makes so much more sense. And here's what happens when you put it all together. The author proposes this retranslation, where wadribuhunna means to admonish with examples, and the final step is taking the issue to a court of law, not taking matters into your own hands. This completely transformed the verse from a justification for abuse into a process for reconciliation and, if needed, legal action. So why does all this linguistic stuff matter in the real world? Well, this is where the author draws a really stark contrast between the vision of marriage in the Quran and certain narratives you find in the Hadith. And for anyone who might not know, the Hadith are collections of the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad.
First, let's look at the Quranic vision. This verse, and many others, describes men and women as mutual protectors, as partners. It's a relationship built on a shared responsibility to do good. This is the foundation the author is building on.
Now, hold that thought and contrast it with this Hadith cited by the author. Here, the act of flogging a wife isn't forbidden, it's just regulated. The text discusses how not to do it, like you would a slave, which implies that the act itself is considered permissible.
And it doesn't stop there. Here's another really stark example from the Hadith that the author points to. It's a narrative describing an act of physical discipline. The author's argument is that it's these secondary texts that have cemented the beat them interpretation of the Quran, even when it seems to clash with the Quran's primary message of mercy.
So what we have, according to the author, are two fundamentally different pictures of marriage. On one side, you have the Quran, which seems to promote a relationship of mutual protection and mercy. And on the other, you have certain hadith that appear to permit physical punishment. The author's central claim is that for centuries, the hadith have been used to incorrectly interpret the Quran.
Okay, so after that deep dive into language and context, what's the big takeaway? What is the vision of marriage that the author believes the Quran was actually trying to promote all along?
For the author, this is the verse that sets the tone for everything. The core principles aren't hierarchy and obedience, they're comfort, love, and kindness. And this, the author argues, should be the lens through which we read every other verse on marriage, including that controversial one we started with.
And all this really leaves us with a final, powerful question to think about. This whole analysis suggests that just a few key translation choices ended up creating a system of hierarchy and violence. It forces us to ask ourselves, how much of our understanding of any sacred text is shaped not by the original words, but by the choices and maybe even the biases of the people who translated it for us?